Welcome to Half-Life 2, Episode 1. We received a great deal of positive feedback on the commentary track in The Lost Coast, and so we've included the same feature in this episode. To listen to a commentary node, put your crosshair over the floating commentary symbol and press your Use key. To stop a commentary node, put your crosshair over the rotating node and press the Use key again. Some commentary nodes may take control of the game in order to show something to you. In these cases, simply press your Use key again to stop the commentary. With episodic content, we are hoping to release games much more frequently than has been possible with the monolithic development schedules of the past. Game developers and game customers have been wanting to try this for years. Please let me know what you think after you've had a chance to play this, our latest installment in the ongoing adventures of Gordon Freeman. I can be reached at gayben@valvesoftware.com. Thanks, and have fun.
Tell me, Dr. Freeman, if you can. You have destroyed so much. What is it exactly that you have created? Can you name even one thing? I thought not.
We used an upgrade of the refract shader from Half-Life 2 to make the Vortigaunts warp into the intro. The major difference is that this time we are only refracting pixels that come from the Vortigaunts themselves. We placed a large sheet of refractive geometry in front of each Vortigaunt to achieve this effect.
This intro sequence establishes some important initial pieces of Episode 1's story and setting. Our earlier versions of the intro sequence were heavy on graphic effects and relatively light on storytelling. When we showed those early versions to playtesters, they thought it was cool, but rarely had any idea what was supposed to be happening. We went through several iterations, each time simplifying the editing and tightening up the effects. We eventually arrived at a good middle ground between the sort of psychedelic look we were shooting for and basic comprehension of what was actually taking place.
We'll see about that.
Players love Dog, so we made sure that he was the first thing you see when you wake up in Episode 1. We also wanted players to get a glimpse of the Crippled Citadel. When Dog lifts you out of the rubble, it's one of the few instances in the game when we take control of the player's view. This allowed us to ensure the player's view lingered briefly on the Citadel before Dog set them down.
The Citadel is supposed to be a building of unprecedented scale. So out of scale with the rest of the world, in fact, that we couldn't render it without our 3D skybox technology. This technology allows us to build the Citadel as a 1/16th scale model off in an unreachable corner of the map, and seamlessly merge it into the scene. We also use this technology to create the illusion of vast spaces and distant horizons.
Since we never take control away from the players, it can be a real pain to get them to notice important environmental events. It's a constant design challenge for us. The Citadel will be erupting in a massive light show that took 10 of us 2 months to orchestrate, and if we're not careful, the player will end up facing the other direction staring at a tire. In this case, to establish that the Citadel is coming apart at the seams, we wanted the player to notice the debris falling off of it. We used a pretty straightforward method here. Alex explicitly mentions the Citadel while pointing at it. Like most of these solutions, it's not foolproof, but it has a high success rate.
This area was redesigned several times in order to keep the player in this space while Alex delivers some exposition. As much as we hated to do it, the final solution was to have Alex climb out while the player looks for an alternate route. We portray Alex as more athletic and nimble than Gordon, so players shouldn't get too irritated by the fact that she can get to places they can't. Honestly, we're not especially happy with this crutch, but it's a trade-off we sometimes have to make so that we can get Alex out of the way of interesting player challenges.
Sometimes we need to keep the player in an area so that we can deliver some critical dialogue or run an important sequence of events. In these cases, we temporarily block the player's path using what we call a gate. These gates generally take the form of some obstacle that can only be removed or opened by some character or event. In this case, the obstacle is a crashed gunship that can only be moved out of the way by Dog. Though the final scene looks pretty straightforward, a lot of care had to be taken to make sure that Dog hit his marks and played his sequences without trampling and damaging the player.
Listen, you
Right off the bat, we needed to hammer home some story points, reintroduce the cast of characters, and explain the player's immediate goal. It was a pretty intimidating chunk of non-interactive exposition. We generally approach these scenes by writing way too much, and then through constant playtesting, trimming the scene to more manageable levels. But in this case, even after some heroic pruning, the opening scene still felt too long. We ended up splitting the introductory sequence into 3 scenes, separated by some gravity gun puzzle solving, and then a dramatic walk across a crumbling ledge.
When we designed the Half-Life 2 facial system back in 2000, our goal was to get a natural-looking performance at a moderate distance. Given our real-time polygon and texture budgets, we chose fairly reserved or constrained performances over ever having the actors' faces get into a bad-looking or unnatural expression. For Episode 1, we wanted to extend the character's facial system to support more intense performances with a wider range of facial expressions that would hold up better at close range. These facial improvements included increasing the detail around the eyes and mouth, increasing the number of facial shape targets, think of these as movements of muscle groups, by about 50%, rewriting the rules that control how these shapes blend, and increasing the intensity of many of our existing shapes. In addition, we added support for controlling the amplitude of the facial movement for lip sync animation, which let us dampen or amplify the mouth shapes based on the volume or intensity of the dialogue.
Monitor scenes are especially difficult to make interesting, since they tend to involve literally just talking heads. By interweaving critical expository information, like how dangerous the Citadel has become, with some dramatic character interactions between Alex, Eli, and Dr. Kleiner, we were able to convert a potential liability into one of the strongest scenes in the game. A great way to illustrate characters' relationships to each other is to have one of the characters in danger and show the other's reactions to it, which is what this scene is all about.
Thanks.
Alex travels through much of Episode 1 with the player, and consequently passes through a wider variety of lighting conditions than she did in Half-Life 2. This meant that we had to improve the quality of the lighting algorithms used on Alex to look realistic in any situation, from the eerie hallways of the Citadel to the streets of City 17 at sunset. For this episode, we added a specular lighting term to the shaders used on Alex, which provides a realistic shiny look to her skin, her leather jacket, and even her teeth. In these new lighting calculations, we chose to specifically emphasize bright highlights caused by illumination from grazing angles. This type of lighting, also referred to as rim lighting, is particularly dramatic when coming from low-angle light sources such as this bright sunset. You'll also note that the rim lighting is further enhanced by our high dynamic range post-processing, which causes the specular highlights to bloom in a striking and dramatic fashion. We have found that the move to an episodic development cycle allows us to take advantage of the fast pace of graphics hardware innovation by incrementally adding new features, such as Alex's new lighting techniques, to the source engine with each new episode.
This ledge is a really tricky spot for NPCs to navigate. While we wanted Alex to be able to maneuver dynamically through any complex environment, in certain navigation situations we're faced with a trade-off between flexibility and visual quality. In this particular case, she navigates the ledge with a combination of AI and scripted animations. We've continued to evolve the systems of Half-Life 2 whereby characters move fluidly through dynamic AI and scripted navigation, but ultimately what matters most is how it looks to the player.
Our games are created by design collectives that we call cabals. When the idea to have you and Alex sit in a van and then have Dog toss it across the gorge was first suggested during a cabal meeting, everyone thought it was funny, and then we moved on to more serious solutions for the gorge crossing. As the design progressed, though, we kept coming back to the van idea, and eventually everyone agreed that we should give it a try. Even though the idea was kind of outrageous, it satisfied some key goals we had for the scene. Alex and the player get across the impassable gorge, and Dog is able to play a key role in the mission, while also plausibly getting left behind. There were still some problems to solve, though. Attaching animated models to the van was tricky, making sure the van didn't kill the player took some thought, and it took a number of tries before we were able to really illuminate Dog's thinking, as he went from testing his idea with chunks of debris to finally presenting the plan to Alex. Ultimately, we were able to create a scene that solved some tricky game design issues, provided an intimate view of the relationship between Alex and Dog, and delivered a surprising and visceral entrance to the Citadel.
It's really important to us to create scenes that showcase strong relationships between our characters. The relationship between Alex and Dog seems to be especially satisfying to players. In the scene leading up to the van toss, we had a bug before the animation was complete, where Dog's head would shake as he looked back at Alex.
I think Dog needs a
In a happy accident, his head shook right after she asked him, "You did do the math, right?" In playtests, players thought this was intentional and always laughed. Because of that, we worked it into the animation, and it ended up being a terrific little moment between Dog and Alex.
Really, that was a little close. What's gotten into you, huh? How exactly is this supposed to help us? What? Wait a minute. Oh no.
To convey a sense of urgency, we originally designed Alex to nag the player pretty frequently. She'd say things like, "Hurry up and keep moving." Whether or not this created a sense of urgency is debatable, but after about 3 minutes of this, the one thing it definitely did was make the player hate Alex. This was one of the observations that eventually led us to switch Alex from generally leading the players to almost always following. Through playtesting, we discovered that players much preferred to set the pace themselves, and that they especially disliked virtually any hint of bossiness from Alex.
We populate our environments with spots where players can take a break to look out over an expanse of cool scenery. We call these vistas. This particular vista was designed to give anyone familiar with the Citadel interior from Half-Life 2 a good view of what it looks like now that everything's falling apart.
I wish we had a map.
The pods that are sliding off their track and into the abyss really sell the idea that the Citadel is half abandoned and in chaos.
We created a new Citadel destruction set of broken Combine panels and prefabs for the interior spaces to help make the Citadel look like it was on the verge of exploding. We also introduced a strong ambient orange color to help sell the fact that the Citadel was in a much different state from the last time the player passed through. The orange atmosphere was justified due to all the fires and smoke inside the Citadel.
The primary goal of the first Citadel map is to communicate to players that the Citadel is falling apart. The Vortex was a late addition to the map, in an effort to beef up the idea that the Citadel was becoming a very dangerous place. We had particular difficulty in conveying the dangers of the area. In early playtests, players thought that the entire bridge was dangerous at all times. Some additional effects work helped let players know where the dangerous areas were. We would have loved to base more gameplay on this Vortex idea, but we just didn't have the time.
And on in here.
We revealed the pod here to let players see it up close. At the same time, we didn't want players to get too good a look at what's inside. An old version of the scene had the pod simply hanging from the ceiling. It would burst open and then charge up your gravity gun, but not do much else. The current scene gives us a much more dramatic reveal of the pod and an opportunity to introduce the mind blasts it's capable of emitting. Though they don't play a large role in Episode 1, these guys were a functional requirement of Episode 2, which meant we effectively had to ship a piece of that episode early.
We decided this space needed to look unique and appear to have more significance than the rest of the Citadel areas the player had already traveled through, while at the same time feeling as though it was still made with Combine technology. This room introduces a story point that plays a big role in Episode 2, so the player has to feel like something important is going on in here. A different fog setting as well as different light styles and configurations helped achieve this. The red lighting is a good contrast to the traditional blue-green colors of the Citadel.
It's important that the player has some empathy for Alex, rather than seeing her as just a bullet-spitting robot. The brief recovery scene after the pod mind attack reminds the player that Alex is also affected by events in the world.
The light bridge ball sockets are a clear example of our training approach to new gameplay elements. We train the players with a leading example, confirm they understand the concept, then switch up the problem set and make them use it in a new way. The first bridge shows players the solution, the second one confirms they understand it, and the third, knowing they understand the gameplay mechanic, challenges them in a new way using that mechanism.
Soldiers!
Impending destruction is a recurring theme in the Citadel. From story, mood, and visual standpoints, this changes the Citadel. The destruction needed to feel natural rather than entirely scripted upon the player's actions. Not showing destructive events dynamically makes the player assume the level of damage is static. However, if the events are too obviously triggered by player movement, the destruction feels too scripted. We found the solution was to give players glimpses of things that were happening at the periphery of the player space, as well as in their immediate vicinity, to give the feeling that stuff is happening whether the player is present or not. Having trained the player that balls fit into sockets, we wanted to introduce a puzzle where the question was how to get a ball into the socket.
The puzzle we came up with involved a socket with an object blocking it, so that the player would have to ricochet a ball into place. This sounded simple until we actually tried to implement it. If we made the covering opaque, playtesters didn't realize that there was a socket behind it. When we made it translucent, they often didn't see it was there, and were confused when their shot bounced off. Making it movable was a red herring, making people think that they could actually knock it away. A couple of subtle art changes helped. We added some more prominent shadowing and made the glass panel flash when it was hit with a ball. Some playtesters consistently searched for a position to get a direct shot, which we didn't discourage as an alternate solution.
There are some little practical details that take a surprising amount of time and testing to get just right. For instance, it took us many playtests to figure out just how fast Alex should move. It turns out that her following behavior looks and feels the best when she's moving faster than the player's normal speed, but slower than the player's sprint speed.
This dropship scene was another case where we had to be clever about drawing the player's attention to something cool that was about to happen, which the player could easily miss if they weren't looking in the right direction. We used a solitary soldier firing at the player to draw their attention to where the dropship climbs into view. Once the player notices the dropship, there's a good chance they'll watch it until the payoff when it crashes.
Did you see that?
This is where some player training pays off. After earlier training players on the use of ball sockets, they get a sort of live fire test here starting the elevator. This is the beginning of the level's puzzle arc, where basic gameplay mechanic is made increasingly more complex by layering other puzzle elements on it. This is where some player training pays off. After earlier training players on the use of ball sockets, they get a sort of live fire test here starting the elevator. This is the beginning of the level's puzzle arc, where basic gameplay mechanic is made increasingly more complex by layering other puzzle elements on it.
Can you get it going again?
The first puzzle only requires that the player find a combine ball and put it in the socket. Here we're presenting the player with a now familiar ball socket challenge, but we're also bridging into some new training, showing the player that stalkers can destroy the combine energy balls.
What's it doing? Good job!
Late in development, we changed the art for these doors so that players understood they were entering the core area. It turned out that having Alex talk about the area wasn't enough to give playtesters the sense that they'd finally arrived at the core.